Picture this. A man walks into a room already loud. Chest out, voice sharp, movements big. He wants to be seen before he's understood. And it works. People notice him. Some step aside. Some go quiet. For a moment, it looks like power. But look closer. That noise. It's not confidence. It's a signal flare. He's announcing something before anyone asked, and that's the first tell. Because real strength doesn't rush the room. It lets the room adjust to it. Here's the uncomfortable part. The people who feel the need to show strength are usually trying to cover a gap, not a small one, a deep one. They're not trying to dominate you. They're trying to convince themselves. Machiavelli saw this centuries ago. He didn't say the loud man was brave. He said the loud man was exposed. Because when you walk in already proving something, you've already admitted doubt. Watch closely and you'll see it everywhere. In offices, gyms, bars, group chats, meetings, the guy who talks the most, the one who interrupts, the one who turns every moment into a contest. He's not leading, he's defending an image he's scared to lose. And here's the quiet part. People miss. The room is watching him. But not the way he thinks. They're not impressed. They're measuring. They're asking one silent question. How stable is this guy, really? Because strength that needs to announce itself feels unstable, like it might crack if pressed. And people sense that instantly. The irony is brutal. The more someone tries to look powerful, the more information they leak about their weakness. This is where most people get it wrong. They think power is volume, presence, intensity. But power doesn't rush in. It settles. It doesn't need to dominate space. It bends it. And the moment you feel the urge to prove something, you've already stepped into a losing position. Because now you're reacting, not choosing. And once you're reacting, someone else is steering. That's the part most people never see coming. They think toughness protects them. But it actually makes them predictable. And predictable people are easy to manage. That's where this really starts. Because the ones who understand power don't try to look strong. They let others reveal themselves first. And that changes everything. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. The loud one isn't dangerous. He's exposed. Every raised voice gives away a boundary, and every aggressive move shows where the edge is. And once people know the edge, they know exactly how far they can push. That's the part no one tells you. The tough guy thinks he's creating fear. What he's really creating is a map of his triggers, his insecurities, his limits. Watch how people react around him. They don't challenge him head on. They adjust, they wait, they store information. The smart ones step back and observe. The dangerous ones start calculating. Because when someone shows you how they react under pressure, they've given you leverage. And that's the paradox. The more emotional you are, the more predictable you become. The more predictable you become, the easier you are to control. This is where most people misunderstand Machiavelli. They think power is about intimidation, about making others flinch. But intimidation is loud, and loud things draw attention. Real power prefers shadow. It moves quietly, watches longer than it speaks, and strikes only when the outcome is already decided. The loud man can't do that. He burns energy too fast. He escalates too early. You see it in small moments. Someone cuts him off in traffic. He reacts. Someone questions him at work. He pushes back. Someone disagrees. He raises his voice. Every time he feels justified. Every time he thinks he's defending himself. But what he's really doing is giving away control. Because escalation is a commitment. Once you step into it, you can't pretend you're calm anymore. You can't walk it back without losing face. And now you're trapped. You either keep escalating or you look weak. That's the trap. The strong don't rush into it. They let others step into it for them. They watch who overreacts, who loses composure, who reveals fear behind confidence. And then they adjust their strategy accordingly. Because power isn't about winning moments. It's about positioning yourself so you don't have to fight at all. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Most tough people aren't dangerous. They're noisy. They think aggression earns respect, but it mostly earns attention from the wrong people. People who probe, people who test, people who wait for mistakes. And when those mistakes come, and they always do, the fall is hard. Because the higher the performance, the more satisfying it is to watch it crack. And that's where things start turning. Because once you understand this, you stop trying to dominate the room. You start reading it. And that shift changes everything that comes next. Here's where it gets uncomfortable. Because once you stop trying to dominate the room, you start noticing something most people miss. The people who actually matter aren't reacting at all. They're not impressed. They're not threatened. They're not even emotionally involved. They're observing. And that should scare you a little. Because silence isn't weakness. Silence is data collection. The loud ones think attention equals influence. But attention is cheap. Influence is selective. Watch how real power behaves in a group. It doesn't rush to speak. It doesn't fight for airtime. It waits until everyone else has shown their hand. Then it speaks once. And suddenly the direction shifts. Not because the voice was louder, but because it landed. This is where the tough guy gets it wrong again. He thinks dominance is about pressure. But pressure reveals structure. And once your structure is visible, you can be broken. Think about it. When someone constantly asserts themselves, they're telling you exactly what they're afraid of losing: respect, status, control. That's not strength. That's exposure. The most dangerous people don't announce their presence. They don't posture. They don't correct everyone in the room. They let others talk themselves into corners. Because every word someone says under pressure gives away priorities, values, weak spots. And once those are visible, the game changes. Here's the part most people never consider. Aggression is reactive, strategy is patient. The aggressive person moves when provoked. The strategic one moves when the timing is right. And timing is everything. That's why the loudest guy is almost always late to the real game. By the time he realizes what's happening, the decisions have already been made without him. He thought he was asserting control. He was actually being studied. And this creates a dangerous illusion. He believes people fear him. In reality, they're adapting to him. They're learning how to avoid him, how to work around him, how to neutralize him without confrontation. And he never sees it coming because he's still performing strength, while everyone else is building position. This is where power quietly shifts hands. Not with confrontation, with absence. Meetings happen without him. Conversations move elsewhere. Decisions get made in rooms he's no longer invited into, and by the time he notices, it feels sudden, unfair, unjust. But it wasn't sudden at all. It was slow, silent, methodical. That's the cost of being predictable. And the more he tries to push back, the more obvious it becomes that he's lost control. Because real power doesn't argue for space. It creates gravity. And once you feel that shift, once you see how influence actually moves, you start asking a different question. Not how do I assert myself, but how do I become someone whose presence changes decisions without saying a word? That's where this goes next. At some point, something strange happens. The loud guy starts to feel invisible. Not ignored in an obvious way. Worse, politely bypassed. People still nod, still smile, still say, yeah, sure. But decisions happen somewhere else. That's when confusion sets in. Because in his mind, he's doing everything right. He's present, he's assertive, he's vocal. So why does it feel like doors are closing? Here's the part most people never notice. Influence doesn't disappear loudly, it fades quietly. First, you're no longer asked for input, then your opinions stop shaping outcomes, then your presence becomes optional. And by the time you realize it, you're already on the outside of the real conversation. This is where Machiavelli's insight cuts deep. Power doesn't announce itself, it organizes reality in advance. While the loud man is reacting to moments, the strategic one is shaping environments. He doesn't argue in the meeting. He decides who's in the meeting. He doesn't fight for attention. He controls access. And that's a different game entirely, because once someone controls the frame, they don't need to dominate inside it. The tough guy never sees this coming. He's too focused on winning interactions. But power isn't about winning moments. It's about deciding which moments exist at all. This is where most people misread Machiavelli. They think he teaches manipulation. What he actually teaches is awareness of timing, of leverage, of human nature. The loud man wants to be feared now. The strategic one is willing to be underestimated for a while. And that patience changes everything. Because when you stop broadcasting your strength, people start projecting onto you. They fill the silence with assumptions. Some underestimate you, some overestimate you. Both are useful. The one thing you never want is to be fully understood. That's when you become manageable. And this is the quiet advantage most people never develop. They reveal themselves too early. They explain too much. They react too fast. They try to control, outcomes directly instead of shaping the conditions that produce them. That's why aggression feels powerful in the moment. It gives immediate feedback. But strategy feels slow, uncertain, invisible, until suddenly it isn't. Until one day you notice people deferring to you without knowing why. They ask before acting. They check your reaction. They adjust their tone. Not because you demanded it, because something about your presence signals consequence, and that's the shift. From performance to position, from noise to gravity, from force to inevitability. And once you understand that difference, you can never go back to trying to be the loudest person in the room, because you've seen what actually moves the room. And the next step is learning how to build that presence deliberately, without ever raising your voice. Here's where the illusion finally breaks. Because once you stop chasing attention, you start seeing how cheap it is. The loud guy thinks he's commanding the room. In reality, he's working overtime for reactions, approval, fear, resistance, anything that proves he exists. But power doesn't need feedback to function. It moves even when no one is watching. And that's the moment most people miss. Real influence works without witnesses. Think about it. The people who truly shape outcomes rarely announce themselves. They don't posture. They don't argue in public. They don't fight for credit. They adjust one variable. They have one quiet conversation. They place one idea in the right mind. And suddenly the outcome changes. No noise, no spectacle, just effect. The loud man can't stand this. Silence feels like loss to him. Invisibility feels like death. So he fills the space with motion, more talking, more asserting, more proving. But every extra move creates friction. Every word becomes something that can be remembered, repeated, used. And this is where the trap closes. Because the more you talk, the more predictable you become. Patterns form, habits solidify, weaknesses show themselves. The strategic mind doesn't need to confront you. It just waits for the pattern to complete itself. And it always does. You see this in offices, in groups, in social circles, in leadership. The person who keeps it real ends up isolated. The one who speaks their mind becomes a liability. The one who doesn't take shit slowly loses influence, not because they're wrong, but because they're loud in a system that rewards control. Power doesn't punish aggression directly, it sidelines it. And that's far worse, because you don't even get the dignity of opposition, you just fade. This is the part people struggle to accept. Being intimidating doesn't make you important. Being useful does. Being feared doesn't make you powerful. Being needed does. And need is built quietly. It's built through reliability, through discretion, through restraint, through knowing when not to speak. The strongest people in the room often say the least because they don't need to convince anyone of anything. Their value is already assumed. And that's the pivot point. When you stop trying to show strength, you create space to develop it. When you stop performing dominance, you start building leverage. And leverage changes everything. Because once you have it, you don't chase outcomes. Outcomes come to you. But there's a cost. You have to let go of the identity that needs to be seen as strong. You have to tolerate being underestimated. You have to sit with the discomfort of not correcting people, not flexing, not proving. That's hard. Ego hates silence, but silence is where power matures. And the people who understand this don't rush it. They let others burn themselves out trying to be impressive. They wait, they observe, they position. And when the moment comes, they act once, cleanly. That's when the shift becomes visible, not loud, inevitable. And the people watching don't even know when it happened. They just know who they listen to now. Here's the part that usually stings. When you stop performing strength, people don't immediately respect you more. At first, they test you. They push a little, they speak a bit bolder. They check if the silence means weakness. And this is where most people panic. They think, see, I should have pushed back. I should have shown teeth. But this moment is the filter. It separates those who are reacting from those who are observing, because the test isn't about dominance, it's about stability. Are you calm when pressure appears? Or do you snap the moment your image feels threatened? The ones who truly hold power don't rush to correct perception. They let behavior speak over time. And that patience unsettles people, because uncertainty is more uncomfortable than confrontation. When someone doesn't react the way you expect, your brain starts filling in the blanks. And those blanks usually grow into respect or fear. That's why restraint is so powerful. Not passive restraint, intentional restraint. The kind that says, I'm aware of what's happening, and I'm choosing not to engage yet. That yet is important, because power isn't about never acting. It's about choosing when action actually matters. Most people act to release emotion. The strategic person acts to shape outcome. That difference changes everything. You can feel it in conversations. The reactive person speaks to discharge tension. The strategic one speaks to create direction. One is emptying himself. The other is building leverage. And leverage compounds quietly. It shows up when people start checking your reaction before they decide something. When your opinion starts to carry weight, even when you say little. When your absence becomes noticeable. This is when power stops being visible and starts being structural. But here's the uncomfortable truth. This phase feels lonely, because you're no longer playing the same social game. You're no longer feeding on approval or conflict, and many people won't know where to place you anymore. Some will misinterpret your calm as weakness. Others will feel uneasy around you without knowing why. That's normal. You're shifting from performer to variable, from participant to factor. And once you become a factor, the rules change. Now people adjust around you. They calculate, they hesitate, they reconsider. And that's when you realize something important. Power doesn't need to announce itself. It only needs to be felt. But there's a danger here. Because restraint without awareness becomes passivity. Silence without intention becomes invisibility. This is where many people stall. They stop performing, but they don't replace performance with presence. They retreat instead of repositioning. And that's not power, that's withdrawal. The difference is subtle, but everything hinges on it. The next step is learning how to be quiet and decisive, how to hold space without filling it, how to let others move while you stay anchored. And that's where real influence begins to take shape. Because once you master that balance, people stop reacting to you and start orienting around you. That's where this is heading. Here's where most people get it wrong again. They think silence is the goal. It's not. Silence is just a tool. What actually matters is control of pace. The moment you stop reacting, you gain time. And time is leverage. When you slow things down, everyone else speeds up emotionally. They fill the space you leave open. They explain themselves. They overcommit. They reveal motives. You just watch. And that shift is subtle, but brutal. Because people are used to resistance. They're not used to stillness. Stillness makes them uneasy. They start wondering what you know, what you're thinking, what you're planning. And uncertainty is far more powerful than intimidation. Here's the uncomfortable truth most never face. The person who stays calm controls the emotional temperature of the room. Anger raises it, fear spikes it, confidence steadies it, and whoever sets the temperature decides the direction of the interaction. That's why real power often feels boring from the outside. No drama, no flare-ups, no theatrics, just quiet decisions that shape outcomes. And this is where the old model of being tough completely collapses. Because toughness depends on reaction. It needs friction to exist. Remove the friction, and toughness has nothing to push against. That's why loud people get more extreme over time. They need more stimulus to feel in control. But the person who understands leverage doesn't need intensity. They need clarity. They know what they want. They know what matters. They know what they're willing to ignore. And that clarity acts like gravity. Others adjust their behavior around it without being told. You've probably felt this before. A room where no one is shouting, yet everyone is careful. A conversation where one person barely speaks, but when they do, the tone shifts. That's not intimidation. That's alignment. People sense coherence. They feel when someone is grounded. And grounded people don't chase validation. They don't rush to correct others. They don't need to dominate to feel secure. They choose their moments. And when they act, it's deliberate. This is where real authority starts to form, not from volume, from consistency, not from fear, from predictability, because when people know what to expect from you, they trust you more, even if they don't like you. And trust is the currency of influence. Without it, you can shout all you want, and nothing moves. With it, you barely need to speak. And here's the quiet shift that happens next. Once people trust your reactions, they start checking with you before acting. They want to know where you stand. They look for signals. You've become a reference point, not because you demanded it, because you earned it. And this is where power stops being about presence and starts being about position. But there's still one trap left, because once you feel this shift, the temptation returns. The urge to step forward, to assert, to show you're in control. And that's where many lose it again. Because the moment you try to use the power, You expose it. The real challenge is learning how to hold it without gripping it. And that's where things get interesting. Here's the paradox most people never resolve. The moment you know you have influence, that's the moment you're most likely to lose it. Because power hates being touched. The instant you try to use it to prove something, it starts leaking away. That's why the most dangerous people look almost indifferent. Not cold, not arrogant, just unbothered. They don't rush to assert control because they don't feel the need to confirm it. They already know where they stand. And that certainty changes how they move. They don't correct every misunderstanding. They don't chase every misinterpretation. They let some things be wrong. That drives people crazy because when someone doesn't defend themselves, the mind fills the gap. And most of the time, it fills it with authority. People assume if he's not reacting, he must be above this. That assumption becomes power. Not because it's true, but because people act as if it is. This is where most fail. They hear silence and panic. They rush in to clarify, to explain, to justify. And the moment they do, they shrink. Because explanations are often a form of apology in disguise. They signal, I need you to understand me. The powerful don't need that. They allow misunderstanding when it doesn't threaten their position. They save clarity for moments that matter. And that selectiveness creates weight. Think about it. If someone explains everything, their words lose value. If someone speaks rarely, every word carries pressure. It's not about mystery, it's about discipline, knowing when to speak, and more importantly, when not to. This is why the truly influential often feel slow. They don't rush to respond. They don't fill silence. They let time do some of the work. And time does a lot of work. It exposes impatience. It reveals insecurity. It shows who needs validation and who doesn't. Meanwhile, the calm one just watches. And the watching is not passive. It's assessment. Who reacts emotionally, who needs approval, who can't tolerate uncertainty. These details tell you everything about how to deal with people. And here's the part most people never realize. The moment you stop trying to look powerful, you start seeing power dynamics clearly. Because you're no longer trapped inside them. You're outside the game, observing it. And from there, you can choose when to step in or when to let others exhaust themselves. This is where influence becomes almost effortless. Not because you're doing nothing, but because you're doing the right thing at the right moment. And that moment is usually quieter than you expect. This is also where ego becomes your enemy. Ego wants to act. Ego wants recognition. Ego wants to be seen winning. But strategy wants patience. And patience feels like loss before it feels like power. That's the test. Can you sit with that discomfort long enough for the situation to turn in your favor? Most can't. They break the silence, they rush the outcome, they reveal their hand, and the game resets. And with them back in the reactive position, the ones who hold steady, they don't look impressive at first. But over time, people start orienting around them, not because they demand it, because it makes sense. And when that happens, you're no longer chasing control, you're setting the conditions others move within. That's real influence, and it's only getting deeper from here. Here's the shift most people never make. They think power is something you do, but real power is something that emerges when you stop forcing outcomes. Once you stop pushing, something strange happens. People start projecting meaning onto your silence. They assume intention where there might be none. They assign depth where there might just be restraint. And that projection works in your favor. Because people don't respond to facts, they respond to stories they tell themselves. And when you stop oversharing, they start filling the gaps. This is where presence turns into gravity. You're no longer trying to convince. You're allowing others to convince themselves, and that's a critical distinction. Convincing creates resistance. Letting someone arrive at a conclusion on their own creates commitment. That's why the most influential people rarely argue. They let others talk themselves into alignment. They ask fewer questions, they make fewer statements. But every word lands heavier because it's filtered, intentional. Consider how often people talk just to avoid silence. They mistake motion for progress. But silence creates pressure, and pressure reveals intent. When you don't rush to fill the space, people show you who they are. They reveal what they want, what they fear, what they're willing to trade. And once you see that, you understand the board. That's when influence becomes strategic instead of emotional. You stop reacting to energy and start reading it. And something else shifts. You stop needing to be right. You stop needing credit. You stop needing to win the moment because you're playing a longer game. And in long games, visibility is risk. The loudest player becomes the target. The quiet one becomes the axis. Everything rotates around them without them pushing. That's why true authority often feels understated. It's not absence of power, it's concentration of it. And this is where most people get uncomfortable. Because if you're not performing, not asserting, not proving, then who are you? That question terrifies people who built their identity on reaction. But if you can sit with it, something shifts. You stop chasing control, you start attracting it. And once that happens, you realize something unsettling. Power isn't taken, it's granted. Given by people who feel safe, seen, and understood in your presence. And the moment people start granting you power, you don't need to ask for it ever again. But that kind of influence demands something most people avoid: restraint. And we're not done yet. Because restraint, when misunderstood, can turn into stagnation, and that's the next trap. Here's where many people quietly sabotage themselves. They learn restraint and then confuse it with inaction. They stop reacting, but they also stop moving. They mistake patience for passivity, and that's when influence starts to decay, because restraint without direction becomes stagnation. Power isn't about freezing, it's about choosing when to move. The problem is that once you step back from noise, you feel the pull to disappear entirely, to stay safe, to avoid friction. But safety isn't power. It's just comfort wearing a mask. And comfort dulls your edge. Real influence lives in tension, not chaos, not stillness, but controlled pressure. Think of it like this. A bow without tension can't shoot. A string pulled too tight snaps. Power lives in the balance. The people who master this don't rush forward, but they don't retreat either. They wait until action matters. And when they act, it lands. This is where discipline replaces ego. You stop acting to feel something, you act to do something. And that shift is subtle but brutal, because now your moves are intentional. You don't speak because you're uncomfortable. You speak because the moment requires it. You don't push because you're threatened. You push because the path needs clearing. That's the difference between reaction and direction. Most people never feel this shift because it's quiet. There's no adrenaline hit, no applause, just clarity. And clarity can feel empty at first, because without noise, you're left alone with your thoughts. No drama to distract you, no conflict to define you, just responsibility. And responsibility is heavy. This is where many turn back. They miss the intensity. They miss the chaos that made them feel alive. So they create friction where none is needed. They pick fights. They provoke reactions. They sabotage peace because peace feels unfamiliar. But if you stay with the discomfort long enough, something stabilizes. You begin to sense when action is necessary and when it's ego asking for attention. That awareness is power, not flashy power. functional power, the kind that builds quietly and holds under pressure. This is where influence becomes sustainable. Because now, your actions are rare, precise, and consequential. People start to notice. Not because you're loud, but because when you move, things change. And once people associate your movement with outcome, they pay attention, not out of fear, out of respect. And respect compounds. That's when restraint turns into authority. But there's still a final trap. One that catches even disciplined people. The belief that they've arrived, and that's where everything can collapse. Because power that stops evolving becomes brittle. And brittle things break. That's what we need to talk about next. Here's the trap that waits at the top. The moment you think you figured it out, you stop paying attention. And that's when power starts to rot. Because stability can quietly turn into rigidity. And rigidity is just weakness that hasn't been tested yet. People who've learned restraint, timing, and presence often make one fatal mistake. They start trusting their past wins more than their current awareness. They stop listening. They assume the room hasn't changed, that people haven't changed, that the rules are still the same. But the world doesn't stay still for anyone. Power decays the moment it stops adapting. This is where many strong figures fall apart. Not because they lose control, but because they cling to it. They rely on patterns that used to work. They repeat strategies that once brought results. They confuse experience with relevance. And slowly, almost politely, the environment moves on without them. They don't notice at first. The signals get quieter, feedback softens, resistance becomes passive. People stop arguing, and start disengaging. That's the danger zone, because resistance means you still matter. Indifference means you're already being replaced. True influence stays alive by staying curious. It watches for shifts. It questions its own assumptions. It updates itself before the world forces it to. That's why the strongest people are often the most adaptable. They're not attached to being right. They're attached to staying effective. They don't defend their identity, they refine it. And this requires humility. Not the performative kind, the real kind. The kind that says, I might be wrong, show me. That mindset keeps you sharp, because the moment you believe you've mastered the game, you stop playing it well. And here's the quiet truth. Power isn't something you hold, it's something you maintain. It needs calibration, attention, adjustment, like balance. Lean too far into control and you become rigid. Lean too far into flexibility and you lose shape. The people who last learn to feel that balance instinctively. They sense when to step forward, when to step back, when to let things unfold, when to intervene. And that awareness only comes from staying awake to change. This is why the strongest figures often look curious rather than certain. They ask better questions than they answer. They observe more than they declare. They don't cling to old victories. They're willing to outgrow themselves. And that's what keeps them relevant. Because the moment you stop evolving, the world moves on without asking your permission. Power isn't something you reach and hold forever. It's something you negotiate every day. And the ones who understand that never stop learning. They never stop adjusting. They never stop listening. And that's why they remain dangerous. Not loud, not dominant, but adaptive. There's one final layer to this. The part almost no one talks about. And it changes how you see everything that came before. Here's the layer most people never reach. Not because it's hidden, but because it's uncomfortable to sit with. At some point, you realize the real battle was never with others. It was with your need to be seen a certain way, your need to feel significant, to feel ahead, to feel secure, and that need quietly drives almost everything. The hunger to be respected, the urge to be right, the impulse to correct, to dominate, to win. Once you see that, something shifts. You stop fighting people and start watching your own reactions. You notice how often your ego wants to step in and take control, how quickly it wants to protect an image. And that's when you understand something uncomfortable. Most power struggles are internal. They happen long before anyone else is involved. The external conflict is just a reflection. When you don't need validation, the world loses its grip on you. Not because you don't care, but because your center isn't outsourced. This is where real freedom begins. You're no longer reacting to approval or disapproval. You're responding to intention. And that changes everything. Your decisions get quieter. Your energy stabilizes. Your presence becomes grounded instead of reactive. And people feel that. Not because you announce it, but because there's nothing to prove. At this level, influence stops being a tactic. It becomes a side effect. You don't try to manage perception. You let alignment do the work. And alignment is rare. It's what happens when your actions match your values, your words match your intent, and your behavior doesn't shift depending on the room. That consistency is disarming. People don't know how to manipulate it, they can't predict it, they can't easily exploit it, because there's no performance to poke at. This is why truly grounded people feel calm in chaos. They're not suppressing emotion, they're not detached. They're integrated, they've made peace with uncertainty. They don't need to dominate it. And here's the quiet truth most never realize. When you stop trying to control how you're perceived, you gain control over how you move. That's the trade. You give up image. You gain freedom. And freedom is the foundation of real power, not the kind that intimidates, the kind that endures. There's one final step after this, not about influence and not about dominance, about responsibility. Because once you see clearly, you can't pretend you don't. And that changes the game completely. Here's where responsibility stops being a concept and starts becoming weight. Because once you see how power actually works, you can't unsee it. You can't go back to pretending you didn't know. Before, you could blame instinct or emotion or the moment. Now you understand the mechanics. You know what silence does. You know what timing creates. You know how easily people read into your restraint. And that knowledge changes the cost of every move you make. Power stops being exciting here. It becomes heavy, because now every action has a shadow. You realize that people aren't just reacting to what you do. They're orienting themselves around it. Your pauses shift momentum. Your words set tone. Your absence creates space others rush to fill. And once you see that, you can't pretend your choices are neutral. This is where responsibility quietly enters. Not the kind that's imposed on you, the kind you accept. You start asking different questions, not can I do this, but what happens if I do? Not will I win, but what will this create? Because power doesn't end at the moment of action, it echoes. And the more influence you have, the longer that echo lasts. That's why the most dangerous people aren't the aggressive ones. They're the careless ones. People who act without considering impact. People who confuse freedom with absence of consequence. Real power demands restraint not because it's moral, but because it's precise. You don't swing unless you know where the blade will land, and you don't move unless you're willing to live with the ripple. This is the part most people avoid, because it means giving up the comfort of impulse. It means holding yourself to a standard when no one else is watching. It means understanding that influence isn't just something you use, it's something you are responsible for. Once you reach this point, power stops feeling like a prize. It starts feeling like stewardship. You don't ask, how do I win this? You ask, what kind of world does this move create? That question alone changes everything. It slows you down, it sharpens you, it forces honesty, and strangely, it makes you lighter because you're no longer reacting from ego. You're choosing from clarity. That's when authority becomes quiet again, not because you're hiding it, but because it doesn't need to announce itself anymore. And now there's only one thing left to confront: what you do when no one is watching. That's where everything either collapses or solidifies. This is where it ends, and where most people never actually arrive. Because when no one is watching, when there's no audience, no pressure, no reward, that's when your real structure shows, not your image, not your discipline in public, your inner alignment. This is the moment where power stops being external altogether. You're alone with your choices, no reaction to manage, no perception to shape, no role to perform, just you and what you do when nothing is at stake. And that's the uncomfortable truth. Real strength reveals itself when there's no incentive to perform, when you could cut corners and no one would know, when you could take advantage and get away with it, when you could choose the easy path and face zero consequences. That's the moment that defines you, not because anyone sees it, but because you do. This is where integrity actually lives. Not in speeches, not in pressure moments, but in the quiet decisions no one tracks. And here's the part few people want to admit: if you can't respect yourself in those moments, no amount of external power will ever make you feel whole. You'll keep chasing validation, keep proving, keep performing, and it will never be enough. But when your actions align with your values, even in silence, something settles. You don't need to posture anymore. You don't need to impress. You don't need to win, because you trust yourself. And that trust becomes the foundation everything else stands on. From there, influence becomes natural. Respect becomes effortless. Authority becomes quiet. Not because you demand it, but because it's felt. This is the paradox Machiavelli hinted at but never spelled out. The strongest position isn't domination, it's self-command. The person who governs himself doesn't need to control others. And once you reach that point, power stops being something you chase. It becomes something that follows, quietly, consistently, without noise. That's the end of the path. Not a crown, not applause, just clarity. And the rare peace of knowing that nothing outside you has leverage anymore.